It's an insurrection, rebellion, anarchy in the streets. Oh, did you miss it? Were you at Pilates when the country descended into lawlessness? Were you scrolling on your phone when it all went down? Hate it when that happens. Or doesn't happen, because a lot of the things the president says are not real.
Portland is burning to the ground. It's insurrectionists all over the place.
Like that. That never happened. But the Trump administration says the president has the absolute right to declare an emergency based on stuff he just made up, and no court can stop him. And he's reportedly considering invoking the Insurrection Act to allow him to put soldiers on American streets to act as policemen.
Well, I'd do it if it was necessary. So far, it hasn't been necessary, but we have an Insurrection Act for a reason. If I had to enact it, I'd do that. If people were being killed and courts were holding us up, or governors or mayors were holding us up, sure, I'd do that. I mean, I want to make sure that people aren't killed.
Yeah, we do have an Insurrection Act for a reason, and that reason is not because the president makes up stories about roving bands of black-clad Antifa members burning down cities. But you can't talk about the Insurrection Act without first talking about the Posse Comitatus Act. In the United States, the military does not engage in civilian law enforcement. Back in ye olde England, the local lawman would call up a crew of able-bodied men to enforce the law and hunt down criminals. On this side of the Atlantic, the sheriff's posse was a regular fixture of the American West. But after the Civil War, southern states didn't want the federal government using the military to enforce desegregation. And so Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act in 1878 to make sure that the former Confederacy could implement Jim Crow laws, ensuring that formerly enslaved Black Americans could never vote or exercise political power. The act is just one sentence. It says, whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or the Space Force as a posse comitatus, or otherwise to execute the laws, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. And despite its sordid origins, the Posse Comitatus Act has become a pillar of American civil-military relations. In this country, the military does not enforce the law. We do not have soldiers in the street. We have civilian law enforcement, both federal and state. And the military has its own justice system, separate and distinct from civil courts. But Donald Trump has never understood this. Way back in 2013, he tweeted, "We need our troops on the streets of Chicago, not in Syria." That would have been entirely illegal, but in 2013, Trump was just a civilian, so it didn't matter if the star of The Apprentice didn't understand the Posse Comitatus Act. Today, it matters. But Trump's understanding of civil-military relations has not evolved.
And I told Pete, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military. As president, I will never hesitate to defend our people from threats of violence, from the horrible plague that's taking place from within.
No, we cannot use American cities as training grounds for our military. Are you crazy? This isn't the Hunger Games. We have millions of civilian law enforcement officers whose actual job is to wield the police power to ensure that people follow the law. And if you think that crime rates are a good metric for how good a job cops are doing, well, crime rates are down everywhere, particularly in cities. But that's just in the real world. Over at the White House,
I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor, and worse.
Because of DC's unique status as a federally controlled city that is part of no state, the president was able to call up the DC National Guard and even send in guard troops from other states. There wasn't a tremendous amount for them to do in a city of just 700,000 people, though, but that didn't stop Trump from taking credit for ending crime in the nation's capital.
The capital of America was a bloodthirsty, horrible, dangerous place, one of the worst. And now it's a crime-free city, and we're going to keep it that way.
Again, he did not end crime in D.C., but that did not stop him from threatening to deploy the military in other Democratic states and cities. It is getting crazy out there, and so now is probably a good time to wipe all your personal and private information off the internet. Your cell phone number, home address, email address, private social media accounts, and tons of sensitive data are shockingly easy to purchase by anybody online. But you can fight back and take control of your private information by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni wipes your personal data from the internet by searching the internet, reaching out to data brokers and websites directly on your behalf and forcing them to remove your private information. If they resist, Incogni will take care of that too, because Incogni fights back. But what makes Incogni truly powerful in taking back control of your privacy is the custom removals feature. It allows you to flag an unlimited number of sites where your data is exposed, and you can even have Incogni's privacy experts review and tackle the most uncooperative data brokers and people search sites. I've been using Incogni for a while now. In that time, you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns for me. I could never do this myself, so thank you to Incogni for weeks of work and adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals because even if the broker removes your data once, they can collect it and publish it again. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you scan the code on screen or click on the link in the description, you'll get 60% off their annual unlimited plan. Or try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you decide you want to keep it, you'll still get a 60% discount so long as you use our code LegalEagle, one word. So sign up for Incogni or we will see you in court. So much of what Trump has done in the past 9 months has rested on emergency powers delegated by Congress. We got constantly shifting tariffs because of the emergency trade deficit. We shipped a bunch of Venezuelan men, most of whom had never been arrested, to seek out prison in El Salvador because Trump said we were being invaded by the Venezuelan government and invoked the Alien Enemies Act. Trump declares an energy emergency to override all environmental regulations. It's clear that Congress believed two things when it drafted those emergency power statutes. First, legislators assumed that the president would act in good faith and not just pull the alarm bell and shout emergency every time he wanted to do stuff that would otherwise be illegal. Second, they took as a given that future Congresses would jealously guard their own power and revoke that emergency authority if the president misused it. Obviously, they bet wrong there too. And maybe those legislators believed a third thing, which is that courts would put a stop to any blatant abuse of emergency authority. Sadly, none of that turned out to be true. Instead, the president is treating endemic issues like acute ones, and he says that his own subjective or even blatantly false characterization of an emergency is the final word and cannot be reviewed by any court. So if he says Portland's on fire and needs the military to keep order, then it's on fire and no court can say, what? No, it's not, and block him from sending in troops. One of these emergency delegations of authority by Congress is 10 U.S.C. Section 12406, which empowers the president to take control of state militias in case of invasion, rebellion, or when he is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. That was the authority Trump relied on to federalize California's National Guard. DHS surged ICE agents into the greater LA area, and they encountered random pockets of sporadic violence, which were immediately quelled by the LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Department. Trump seized on that moment of violence as justification to send in the National Guard and Marines. The Justice Department argued that the president's declaration that he's unable to execute the laws is unreviewable by any court. Here, have a video. Have two. The Ninth Circuit said that courts do have the right to review the president's determination under 12406, but that it wasn't totally crazy to say that the rioting in LA hindered the president's ability to execute the laws, and so the deployment of the National Guard was legal. Notably, even guardsmen legally deployed under Section 12406 are subject to the Posse Comitatus Act. The state of California sued, alleging that virtually everything the Guard was doing on the ground in Los Angeles violated that law. And Judge Charles Breyer agreed. He said defendants systematically used armed soldiers whose identity was often obscured by protective armor and military vehicles to set up protective perimeters and traffic blockades, engage in crowd control, and otherwise demonstrate a military presence in and around Los Angeles. In short, defendants violated the Posse Comitatus Act. He based that in part on this training slide. See how it's got a list of prohibited law enforcement activities, but 4 of them are highlighted in red? The judge found that the troops were orally instructed that the 4 functions listed in red, security patrols, traffic control, crowd control, and riot control, were subject to a so-called constitutional exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. Essentially, the Defense Department took the position that when federal agents or facilities were under attack, troops are allowed to engage in these law enforcement functions, which may make sense, except that the government took the position that wherever federal personnel go, National Guard troops can accompany them and establish perimeter control, engage in crowd control, and otherwise perform any functions necessary to ensure the execution of federal functions and the safety of federal personnel. And in fact, they argue that even when there is no threat to the safety or security of federal personnel or property, the mere possibility that federal law enforcement agents might not be able to do their job could justify deployment of National Guard troops as a preventative measure, which means that the exception functionally swallows the rule, and they can violate the Posse Comitatus Act at will. The Ninth Circuit stayed that ruling by Judge Breyer and has not yet addressed it as of this recording. So as of today, Guard troops can and are doing things which a court has found violate the Posse Comitatus Act. But remember up top when Trump said he might invoke the Insurrection Act if courts didn't let him do what he wants? That is what he means. Okay, but let's come back to that in a sec, because first we need to talk about Portland and Chicago, the next two cities where Trump wants to send in troops. On the campaign trail, Trump promised to solve crime in a matter of weeks through the judicious application of police brutality.
You know, if you had one day, like one real rough, nasty day. Now, if you had one really violent day, one rough hour, and I mean real rough, the word will get out and it will end immediately.
But he's been in the White House for 9 months and he's still banging that drum.
We've been living through a horrific cycle of political violence in this country. Night after night, Antifa wreaks havoc on our streets of our cities.
Again, there is no Antifa crime wave. That is totally made up. There is absolutely no evidence that the man who killed Democratic lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, Mark, was affiliated with anti-fascist movements. And there's no evidence that Portland, Oregon is under siege by Antifa. It looks like what happened is that Fox News aired this video on the evening of September 4th.
I watched today. I didn't know that was continuing to go on, but Portland is unbelievable what's going on. Destruction of the city. You know, that was not on my list, Portland, but when I watched television last night, what they've done to that place is it's like living in hell.
That footage is from protests outside the local ICE detention center in 2020. Nothing like that has taken place in years, but President Couch Potato saw it and decided that the city was on fire now. On September 27th, Trump ordered Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to flood Portland with troops, and the next day, Hegseth issued a memo to Oregon's Governor Tina Kotek purporting to federalize 200 troops pursuant to Section 12406. The state filed suit to block the president seizing control of its militia, noting that the Portland police had consistently made themselves available to the federal agents stationed at the ICE facility in their town, and they'd received 0 requests for assistance since June, when there were a few minor acts of vandalism by protesters. The lawless mayhem and attacks on ICE agents Trump talks about never happened. Although Kristi Noem has been creating content with conservative podcaster Benny Johnson, trying to whip up terror about guys in inflatable frog and chicken costumes.
Man in the chicken outfit, I just see him now. Goodness sakes. He could do better. It's too bad they're uneducated and ill-informed.
Judge Karen Immergut, a Trump appointee to the federal court in Oregon, held a hearing and issued a temporary restraining order barring the federalization of the state's guard. As she pointed out, Section 12406 requires a presidential determination that there's rebellion, or at a minimum that he can't carry out the laws. And that's just not the reality on the ground, where the protests in Portland have generally involved fewer than 50 people and have been wholly peaceful. In the entire month before Trump called up the guard, there were 4 incidents of protesters clashing with federal agents. The first involved protesters setting up a makeshift guillotine to intimidate federal officials. The second involved 4 people shining overpowered flashlights in the eyes of drivers. The third involved someone posting a photograph of an unmarked ICE vehicle online. And the last involved additional drivers having flashlights shown in their eyes. And then, when the Trump administration tried to get around that order by deploying National Guard troops from other states like Texas, Judge Immergut held an emergency hearing on Sunday night and issued a second TRO to block the deployment of any state's militia inside Oregon. The judge was big mad, and when a judge reminds you that you are an officer of the court repeatedly, well, she's not asking because she thinks your arguments are consistent with the ethical practice of law. But the Ninth Circuit was apparently not convinced. The appeals court has not issued a ruling as of this recording, but we did watch the oral argument on October 9, and it seemed like the panel was leaning pretty heavily in favor of letting the president deploy the guard.
That's a little bit of the irony here, is that because the president acted in June in L.A., I mean, I don't know that we have the, I don't know, but it seems like we don't have the same level of violence going on in L.A. right now. But the president acted when there was violence, and you're saying, well, if you don't hit it within a narrow window, you lose your right. That just seems unnaturally constrained.
Well, what we have is a finding from the district court that the federal law enforcement officers, unaided by military forces, were capable of not only quelling the violence in June, but also preventing it through September. These are
I'd like to ask you about some specific facts that I don't think are disputed. So the facility was forced to close. It was inoperable for almost a month, from June 13th to July 7th. And the declarations from the director of the Federal Protective Services and the field operations director from DHS state that the facility only reopened because of a surge of 115 Federal Protective Services officers to Portland, right? So those are facts that occurred, but that the district judge didn't consider because she apparently viewed them as out of time, that this had occurred. Are those not facts that are relevant to for the president to determine the threat?
If we said forces are allowed, and then what, we come back the next day and say, oh, well, you got it under control. Now they're not allowed. Then it goes back up. Oh, they're allowed. I mean, it just seems like such a tortured reading of the statute. I mean, I'm not even sure President Lincoln would have been able to bring in forces when he did, because he'd have to wait. You know, if he didn't do it immediately after Fort Sumter, your argument would be, oh, things are okay right now.
So it seems pretty likely that soldiers will soon be patrolling the streets of Portland, keeping America safe from the dangerous scourge of people dressed as unicorns and dinosaurs. Meanwhile, the president has set his sights on Chicago as the next city to get troops in the streets. Trump has long fantasized about militarizing law enforcement in the Windy City. In 2022, he said that the president would have no choice but to send the National Guard to Chicago to fight crime. Again, crime is down in Chicago by a lot. And even if it weren't, it would still violate the Posse Comitatus Act to send in the National Guard to stop it.
And this cannot go on anymore. Every other approach has been considered and tried, and they've tried the weak approach. They've been trying it for years, and really trying it over the last couple of years, and it's not working. It's time to go a different direction. And only one option remains. The next president needs to send the National Guard to the most dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago until safety can be successfully restored, which can happen very, very quickly.
And remember, soldiers are not policemen. They're not trained to enforce the law or even to obey it. Civilian law enforcement officers are supposed to understand what constitutes grounds for a search, rules of engagement with the public, like when you can engage in a high-speed chase of a suspect. That's not what the National Guard does, and it's frankly not what ICE does either.
Yeah! Oh, what? Y'all some crazy. Y'all got no heart, for real. No heart. No heart.
And it's important to note that the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration about Chicago doesn't really have anything to do with immigration enforcement. Remember, the reason they gave for deploying troops to LA was that ICE agents weren't able to conduct raids fast enough because of the protesters, and the reason they needed to go into Portland because of the non-existent attacks on the ICE facility. What's the emergency here in Chicago? Why is Customs and Border Patrol riding around on the Chicago River loaded for bear? Here, the pretext involves protests outside an ICE facility in Broadview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. Those protests have been minor, but that hasn't stopped federal officials from unleashing indiscriminate volleys of pepper balls, rubber bullets, and tear gas. Here they are shooting a priest in the head with a pepper ball as he prays in front of the facility. On October 4th, Hegseth sent a memo to Illinois demanding to federalize 300 of the state's National Guard. 2 days later, the state sued, seeking a temporary restraining order to block deployment of soldiers in the state, alleging that it would violate the terms of Section 12406, the 10th Amendment, and the Posse Comitatus Act. President Trump claims that Governor Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson have refused to protect ICE agents in Illinois from Antifa mobs. He even demanded that they be arrested. In reality, local and state police have actively worked to interpose themselves between protesters and federal agents, and claims that the federal government is unable to execute the laws are pretty substantially undercut by DHS's constant press releases bragging about the wild success of its Chicagoland operation, which they've dubbed Midway Blitz, and saying stuff like, Antifa and their friends haven't stopped us. They're not even slowing us down. ICE certainly doesn't seem to be intimidated. On September 29th, DHS used Black Hawk helicopters to raid an entire apartment building. As the state notes, while it is not clear whether any part of that conduct was within any lawful federal authority, defendants were not impeded in executing this large-scale planned operation. Illinois argues that the Trump administration can't claim it needs to call up troops to execute the laws while simultaneously patting itself on the back for what a good job it's doing executing those laws. On October 10th, Judge April Perry issued a temporary restraining order barring the federalization of Illinois' National Guard. She said that the government had failed to demonstrate that it was unable to execute the laws as required under Section 12406. Here, defense have made no attempt to rely on the regular forces before resorting to the federalization of the National Guard, nor do defendants argue, nor is there any evidence to suggest that the president is incapable with the regular forces of executing the laws. Therefore, the statutory predicate contained within Section 124063 has not been met on that basis alone. That order was partially stayed by the Seventh Circuit, which allowed the Guard troops to be federalized but not deployed and sent out into the streets. We will see what happens there. I think Spencer's got a video on the hopper on that one. But what if courts tell Trump no? What if this move to use the military to enforce immigration laws by protecting ICE agents does get blocked by the judges? Well, then we're going to be in uncharted territory. The most important thing to know about the Insurrection Act is that it is an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. If the president invokes the Insurrection Act, he can send troops into the cities to enforce the law. So you could potentially have the military conducting immigration raids in major U.S. cities. Lots of media commentators refer to that as a major escalation, but I do not get paid to spout euphemisms, so I'm going to tell it to you straight. That would be a fucking nightmare, and it's one that may be coming sooner than we think. Recently, Trump posted an attorney general's opinion from 1965 advising President Johnson on the legality of invoking the Insurrection Act to protect civil rights protesters on their march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, which is kind of amazing from a guy who wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act to disperse the mostly peaceful protests in 2020 after George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis. But let's go back to the beginning. After the Revolutionary War, the brand new American government needed cash to pay its war debt, and so it imposed an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits, aka whiskey. Farmers in western Pennsylvania decided they just weren't going to pay it, and sometimes they attacked the tax collector to get their point across. After 3 years of increasing violence, President George Washington raised a militia to go put down this whiskey rebellion. Those troops were convened pursuant to the Militia Act of 1792, which required a Supreme Court justice to concur that there was rebellion in the land, and Justice James Wilson did just that in 1794. That law was the predecessor to the Insurrection Act of 1807, which allows the president to call up the military in cases of insurrection, rebellion against the government, or inability to execute the law. Note that this version of the statute does not require buy-in from the Supreme Court. Multiple presidents have invoked the Insurrection Act when faced with local refusal to enforce the law. In the modern era, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson relied on the Insurrection Act when they summoned the militia to enforce court orders mandating desegregation in the southern states. But remember, in those cases, federal troops were sent in because local governments refused to enforce federal law.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
That was Governor George Wallace, who stood in the door of the University of Alabama and blocked black students from entering. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used his state's National Guard to block the desegregation of Little Rock High School. That was actual refusal to comply with a federal law and a direct order of the Supreme Court. President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act to quell riots in Los Angeles after white police officers were acquitted of the brutal beating of Rodney King. But that was a breakdown of law and order entirely unlike what we're seeing anywhere in America today. Trump is defining insurrection down to people shining flashlights in ICE agents' faces and blocking the driveway to a detention center in an act of civil disobedience. And let's be clear, Trump has been talking about the Insurrection Act since the very first day he was sworn in, long before any of these protests took place. On January 20th, he signed a declaration of a national emergency at the southern border and instructed the Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security to submit a joint report regarding additional actions that may be necessary to obtain complete operational control of the southern border, including whether to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807. Of course, Illinois is nowhere near the southern border, but it's not a lawless hellhole either. So the question here is essentially, what will courts do if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act and claims authority to use troops to enforce laws in crowded urban areas? Will they accept absolutely any law breaking as sufficient predicate for the president to claim he can't execute the law and has to bring in the military? What if the president really believes that Antifa or gang members or little green men from Mars are burning down a city? Is that good enough? Can the president's alternative facts satisfy a court? The signs here are not good. Multiple panels on the Ninth Circuit have now said that the president can call up troops on the flimsiest of pretexts. More or less, any impediment to executing the law is good enough to satisfy the preconditions of Section 12406. Trial judges have pointed out the problem with this argument. In California, the government argued that it could have deported more people faster if not for the protest. Judge Breyer noted that even assuming that defendants are correct, the statute, that is 12406, does not allow for the federalizing of the National Guard when the president faces obstacles that cause him to underperform in the executing the laws. Nor does the statute allow for the federalizing of the National Guard when the president faces some risk in executing the laws, though of course federal employees should never have to fear danger when performing their jobs. The statute requires that the president be unable to execute the laws of the United States. That did not happen here. But the appeals court disagreed and allowed the president to federalize California's National Guard. In Illinois, Judge April Perry pointed out that the logical end of the government's argument is that any violation of federal law is sufficient justification for militarization, right? I mean, by that logic, Trump is allowed to call up the National Guard every time someone doesn't show up for jury duty. Meanwhile, the administration keeps pointing generally to crime and saying that it would justify sending soldiers into the streets.
Crime has gotten out of control in our cities because our ICE agents, the people who are enforcing our immigration laws, have faced a 1,000% increase in violent attacks against them. We have people right now who are going out there, who are doing the job the president asked them to do, who are enforcing our immigration laws. They're being assaulted, they're being beaten, they're being shot at. The problem here is not the Insurrection Act or whether we actually invoke it or not. The problem is the fact that the entire media in this country, cheered on by a few far-left lunatics, have made it okay to tee off on American law enforcement. We cannot accept that in the United States of America.
Yeah, we can't just let that stuff go unrebutted here.
Well, you just heard a tidal wave of lies from the Vice President of the United States. It's a bit shocking, and you heard over and over again him just making things up on national television with you. You know, there's a reason why the judge here in federal court said that the administration lacks credibility, and why even the Nobel Prize Committee chair said that the administration lacks integrity.
And so we wind up back at the Supreme Court again with the same question. Does the president get to define reality by executive fiat, and can courts evaluate the so-called emergency declaration? The vibes are not good.
Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front, and your lawyers only get paid if you do, to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you, or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a Social Security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.